Bright Cutie. Every student matters.
Hello everyone, let's start with our next topic here. So if you remember, we have already learnt about the rise of middle class under which heading? In this heading, that is factors that led to the rise of nation states. Now, while we were talking about the rise of middle class, we saw that they started spreading the idea of or ideology of liberalism. So here we will try to understand what does this liberalism mean. So let us try to understand that. Now students, when we are talking about the term liberalism, now this was an ideology that was developed by the coming up of new middle class. The middle class that was educated, and it consisted of people from various professions, be it the lawyers, be it the doctors, teachers, philosophers and so on. Now all these people, they had one thing in mind. What was that? To be free. So the term liberalism, if we divide it into two parts, the first part here is liber, and this term, that is liber, it means to be free. So here we can connect the dots, right? So for new middle class, this was the concept, and this concept, it meant freedom of individual and equality of all before the law. Now if someone asks you that what does liberalism mean for the middle class, we have 2 points here. The first one is freedom of the individual, and the second term here that you have to write down is equality of all before the law. Now this was the main idea, and these were the ideas that were spreading throughout the Europe with the rise of middle class. So here we have to connect with the rise of new middle class and this spread of ideology, that is liberalism, and how it led to the rise of nation states. Now definitely when a person feels free and he also sees that he is given equal status in the society, there is a connection. A lot of people who were demanding or spreading these ideas, they were connecting through it, right? And that is how there was a sense of belongingness among all these people. They were sharing a common idea, right? And eventually all these things, it led to the rise of nation states, about which we are reading now, right? Now we have to understand that the term liberalism, it was different in different contexts. Now when we talked about the middle class, or let's say in a society, the term had a different meaning, right? When we are talking about the people who were living there. But when we are talking about liberalism in political terms, it has altogether different meaning, but it was related to the idea that middle class were spreading, okay? So when we are talking about liberalism or the meaning of liberalism in political terms, what does it mean? It means to have a constitution. Now let us try to connect with it with our country. In our country, do we have a constitution? Yes. So when we are talking about the 19th century, in that period, students, definitely there was no concept of constitution, right? Because people were not feeling free. There was this absolute monarch, okay? So all these changes that were happening in society, that was against the established king or the monarch. So they wanted to have a constitution. They wanted to have an elected representative government, like we have today in our independent country, India. They also wanted to have a parliamentary system. Then they wanted to have the ownership of private property, last but not the least, we already have learnt about this point, that is end of the privileges of aristocracy. So you have to understand 2 to 3 points here, and definitely all these points are common. The first point here, constitution, representative government, parliamentary system, ownership of private property. Now what does this show to us? It shows that they wanted to have a government that was chosen by them and not the hereditary government that was already there, or the established monarch that was already there in Europe. Okay. So here all these points can be related to the independent country that we are living in. We already have a constitution, we have a representative form of government, we have the parliamentary system, we also have the ownership of private property, that is in the mixed economy form. So let's not get there, but you have to understand this point, that they were living in a society, okay, and everyone should have the power, or they should own this private property, right? Privileges of aristocracy was to be ended in Europe, okay. So these are some important points that you have to keep in mind. Now let's have a look at the drawbacks of liberalism. We already have learned 2 points here. The first one is when we are talking about in terms of society, and then in the political term. Here we have to understand what were the drawbacks of liberalism when we are talking about these two contexts. The first one here is it did not grant equal rights to men without property and all women. Yes, students. Now while they were fighting about one point here, that is equality of all. But do you know that this concept was really flawed? When we are talking about equality of all, it never meant that all these people who were the poor people or men without property, they did not have any property of their own, and apart from that, all women, irrespective of being rich, poor and so on, they did not have the right to vote. So this whole idea of equality of all was really flawed here, and it is one of the drawbacks of liberalism. The second point here is no universal suffrage, directly related to this first point. Like I told you that all these people who were men without property and all the women, they did not have the right to vote. Here the term universal suffrage, it means right to vote. Second point here that you have to keep in mind, because what did you read in the beginning? You read that liberalism, it means to be free, and for middle class it was freedom of individual and equality, giving them the equal status in the society. But are we seeing that here? No, not every men and women, they were treated equally. The third point here is women had to struggle for their political rights. Yes, students. Now you already have learnt about different revolutions in class 9. Whether it is the French Revolution, whether it's the Russian Revolution or any other revolution. We see that women, they always had to fight for their rights. They had to form organizations, they had to take this movement to another place, right? The feminist movements, the women movements, and they had to be together in order to challenge the established monarchy. So definitely these men and women, they were not getting equal rights, and that is why these women had to struggle for their political rights. So these were some of the drawbacks of liberalism. Let's talk about the meaning of liberalism when we are talking in the terms of economy. Now in economic terms, the idea of liberalism was again different from the other two ideas that we have read. Now what does this mean here? It means the freedom of markets. The second point, end of state restrictions on movement of goods and capital. Here we are talking about the economic term, okay, in terms of economy, right? So, when we are talking about economy, definitely it is related to the markets. The exchange of goods that took place in markets. Now, at that time, there was a different scenario. What was that? People, they had to pay tariff or tax while they were exchanging their goods in the markets, right? There were certain restrictions at one or other place where people had to pay these tariffs, and it was really expensive, right? People could not afford that, and that is why they wanted this freedom of markets, freedom from the restrictions that were kept on them in these open markets. Apart from that, end of state restrictions on the movement of goods and capitals. Now students, in economy you must have heard of two terms here, import and export, right? Now what is export? Going out of goods from one country to another, right? And what do you understand by import? Coming up of goods in one country from another country, right? Coming in of the goods. So basically, when the goods are exported or when the goods are imported, there is a certain tariff barrier there, or the tax that was imposed on these goods. So, all these state restrictions on the movements of goods or capital from one place to another, it definitely irritated or agitated the working class there, the middle class there, and they wanted an end to it. And this was the idea of liberalism for all these people here. And in order to end or abolish these tariff barriers that was imposed on these people, the business class, this led to the formation of zollverein. Okay, another important term for you here, that is the formation of zollverein. Now, why was it done? It was done to abolish the tariff barriers and end the state restrictions. And where was it formed? So it was formed in Prussia and in the year 1834. Okay, now there is a new term for you here. What is that? It is zollverein. Look at this map of Europe here, students. Now this was the confederation. When we are talking about the region, German Confederation, that was formed in the year 1834. So it was a customs union that reduced the number of currencies from 30 to 2 and abolished the tariff barriers, like I told you right now. So let us try to understand this. What is this? Zollverein. In simple terms, you have to write the definition here. So customs union that was formed in Prussia in 1834 and joined by a group of states whose main motto was to abolish the tariff barriers and reduce the number of currencies. Okay. So this is the basic definition here. Now let us try to understand this idea of zollverein. You read that it was a customs union. Union, it means association, right? So the basic idea here was to abolish trade or tariff barriers. Now, why did they want to abolish tariff barriers? Now, let us try to understand why did they want to abolish the tariff barrier. Now, let's take an example here. You can see this map here, students. The map here shows the confederation of 39 states, right? This is the region of Prussia where the zollverein or customs union was formed, right? Now, it was joined by a number of other states, the German states, okay? So, basically it was a confederation of 39 states. Confederation here is association, okay? So, basically association of 39 states. Let's take an example to understand why was it done or why did they demand that. So, let's say a person who is traveling from Hamburg to Nuremberg. Okay, and here this is this merchant who wanted to sell his goods in Nuremberg, right? Now we are talking about the state imposed restrictions. So this person, he had to travel through 11 tariff barriers. I'm just taking an example here. Let's say any number, 10, 5, 8, whatever. So this person, he had to cross 11 tariff barriers, and everywhere he had to pay some tax. He had to pay some customs in these regions, let's say 4% or 5%. And the currencies in these different states were also different. Like the value of currency was different in different places. Now, can you imagine how much calculation that merchant had to go through, or the person who was involved in the customs? Definitely, it was a hectic task. So they wanted an uniformity, and therefore they wanted to abolish the tariff barrier that they had to pay at every region they stopped, and also they wanted to get uniform custom here, or they wanted to change the value of currency. That is why the currencies, they were reduced from 30 to 2. At first there were 30 values, right? And now it was reduced to 2 to get this uniformity. And this was all about the idea of Zollverein, or the Zollverein that was formed. Okay. Now students, let's move on to the questions that have been asked in your exercise section from this very topic. Now in very short answer questions, you will find the first question, that is, what does the word liberalism mean? Now if this question is for 1 mark, you have to write 2 to 3 sentences here, not more than that. 2 sentences would be suffice. So here you have to first write the term liber, it means free. We already have learned. And in short, you can write that for middle class, what did it mean? So for middle class, it meant the freedom of individuals and equality, or giving equal status in the society, right? These are the 2 important keywords that you have to keep in mind here. Okay. The second question in very short answer type questions is, what was Zollverein? Now we already have learnt about Zollverein in great detail here. So I can assume that you will write this answer very nicely. So Zollverein here in simple terms is German Customs Union, that was the coalition of German states. So basically Prussia is the state there in Germany when we are talking about Germany in 1815 or 1830s period. So German Customs Union, that was coalition of German states, formed to manage tariffs and economic policies within their territories. So the main idea was to abolish tariff barrier, right? We already have learned about it right now. And the reduction of currencies from 30 to 2. So this was the 2 main ideas, and when Zollverein was formed, this idea was executed. Okay. Now, there is one question in long answer type question that you have to keep in mind, and you have to answer it very nicely. So, the third question says, explain liberalism in political and economic fields prevailing in Europe in the 19th century. Now, we already have learned about it in great detail here. So, I have written some points that you should mention it whenever you get this question in your exam. So, in political terms, liberalism stood for a constitution, representative government, ruling by consent, ownership of private property, and end of aristocratic privileges. Okay. So, here you have to understand that they wanted a representative form of government where the choice of all mattered by everyone's consent. Okay. Stood for a constitution, ownership of private property, and also end of aristocratic privileges. So this you have to mention when we are talking about in political terms. Now, in economic terms, it stood for freedom of markets, end of state restrictions of movement of goods and capital, and also formation of custom unions or Zollverein by Prussia in 1834 that was joined by other German states. So this is how you are going to answer this question. Am I clear here? Definitely you will answer this question, but when we are talking about long answer type question, you have to write it in great detail. I have mentioned the points here. Now you can explain all these points that you have learned. You can also give the example, right? The example that I've talked here right now, you can also mention this example whenever this question is being asked in your exam.